Cynthia Burlack, Mrs. Cynthia Burlack, excuse me. And, last year, when I was scouting around for subjects to be delivered this year, I stumbled across Mrs. Burlack because I knew the carpenter who did some work on her house, Ben Walker Jr. And so we were just reminiscing about the building. And as it turns out, she basically volunteered to do this. Didn't even have to ask. And, now, her background, I was told by her and her friend that she's been basically in many places. She's lived north of the Arctic Circle. And she, in 1990, was the age group downhill ski racing champion. And when I asked her what age group that was, she looked at me kind of crossly and wouldn't answer. Anyway, without any further ado,
Thank you. I'm so glad to see you all out on such a cold winter's night. And the information that I have is information that I have researched and found from very vague records and people's telling me in conversation. So if anybody has any information that's more accurate or additional to what I have to say, I'd be more than happy to hear it. The history of our farmstead is very much intertwined with the history of all the other houses in the area, specifically King Philip Road here in Sudbury. And that's what you'll see throughout this presentation. In the early 1700s, it was a tumultuous time for Sudbury. They had been petitioning the General Court in Watertown, which was Boston, to divide Sudbury into two parts, because there was a church on the east side of the river and none on the west side, and the pioneers on the west side, this side of the river, of Sudbury River, had a difficult time getting to the compulsory church services. So in 1723, the first church on the west side was built on Rocky Plain, where the Unitarian Church now stands in Sudbury Center. There are many natural dangers prevalent at the time, too. One day, a team of horses from Brookfield was coming into town and was struck dead with a single flash of lightning. Also, there was a threat of Indians, they were somewhat subdued after the King Philip raid in 1676, but they were still a very real danger. John Goodnow came over from England on the Confidence in 1637 with his brothers Edmund and Thomas. They were large landowners, being some of the first in Sudbury. John Goodnow had two daughters. One was Jane, who married Benjamin White. They had 5 sons and a daughter, Experience White, born in 1705. Experience met Josiah Richardson, who was born in Chelmsford in 1701. They married in 1728, as is documented in her diary, which you have a page of in your handout. They lived with his parents, most likely, as was common among newlyweds. And they built a house on the westerly end of King Philip Road on land that was transferred to Experience by her dad in 1730, as seen in the first deed I have over there on the table. This house is presently owned by Esther Skog, whose mother was Anna Richardson. She and her sister Grace grew up on King Philip Road. And Grace, her sister, met Shirley Smith, who lived in our house. They are the parents of Thelma Smith Ernst, who's here tonight. In 1737 to 1742, Josiah bought 70 acres from Joseph Parmenter, and those deeds are also on the table as number 2. Joseph's wife was Mary Gibbs, and this was all land on the westerly side of Green Hill. This added to Josiah's already large farm. So the chances are that our house was built by Joseph Parmenter and his wife Mary because of the fact that it dates back so far. The windows have glass in it that dates back to the mid-1700s. The layout of the rooms is conducive of that time, and it has sheathed clapboards, which are hand-cut and were fit together before 1800. Josiah and Experience Richardson had 3 children. Only Josiah Jr. lived a long life. One died at age 4 and one at age 28. Lieutenant Josiah, who's Josiah Sr., died in 1770, leaving Josiah Jr., who was born in 1733, his house, which is now Esther Skoggs. Josiah Jr. married Elizabeth in 1850, and they had 5 children. Gideon married Lucy Hemingway, and they had 13 children. And the chances are good that they built a house on the Jacobsons' property on King Philip Road, but it wasn't the present house that's there now. And some of those maps on the table, you can see that the Gideon Richardson house was in approximately that same place. Another son was Luther Richardson, who married Persis Hemingway. He was a builder and left 11 acres in Mill Village and probably built Betsy Kane's house. They had a daughter, Lucy, who was born in 1793, who eventually married Gardner Hunt, who was a storekeeper at the corner of the Boston Post Road and Concord Road, and also the uncle of the first documented owner of our house. Experience died in 1876 and was probably living with Josiah Jr. and Elizabeth. Josiah Jr. and Elizabeth were living with Gideon and Lucy at the time of their death in 1833 and 4 on the Jacobsons' land. Gideon's children, of the 13, there were only a few that were prominent in the neighborhood's history. Benjamin Hemingway Richardson married Emily Cutter in 1819. Emily was the daughter of Joseph and Prudence Cutter, who probably lived in the Hawes house, which was most likely built by Cutter himself or Luther Richardson. Benjamin Hemingway Richardson and Emily built the Blakey's house in 1820, most likely, the Blackie's house, most likely in 1820. Their children were Benjamin Hemingway Richardson Jr., who eventually was executor to Gardner Hunt Smith's estate when he died, and Gardner Hunt Smith is the first documented owner for our house. And Laura Ann and Emily were Benjamin Richardson's other children. Gideon's other of the 13 kids were Abel, who was a miller in Mill Village, Lucy Stone, who eventually married Joseph Cutter, who was the brother of Emily, who had married Lucy's brother. You can see how intertwined this gets. They had a daughter, Lucy Cutter, who married Hiram Goodnow, and they continued to live in the Hawes house in the late 1800s. In the mid-1800s, on the west side of Concord Road and Boston Post Road was the Tavern Stand, it was called. And that's where McKinnon's Liquor is now. So there's been liquor sold on that corner for a while. On the east side of that same corner was the store owned by Gardner and Luther Hunt. Today it's a real estate office, and it was just down the road from Josiah Richardson's house, which is Esther Skoggs' house now. Gardner Hunt was born in 1792, and he married Lucy Richardson, the daughter of Luther, who we spoke about before. Luther was a builder, and his wife Persis Hemingway Richardson. Gardner Hunt and Lucy were first cousins. It was not unusual for first cousins to marry at that time. And they probably lived by the store. Gardner Hunt's sister was Sarah, and she married Abel Smith Jr. in 1807. And her son was Gardner Hunt Smith, born in 1814, who did live in our house. Right around this time, I have documentation of land being passed among several different owners, which is probably at least part of the Green Hill Farm. In deed number 3 over on the table, you'll see in 1826, Asher Goodnow purchased part of Green Hill Farm from Harry Howe. In 1833, Asher sold to Edward H. Gibbs. And Gibbs also bought some land from Ruth Moore. Now, it always sounds as though there are a lot of different names coming in here, whereas in the Richardson family, the houses got passed from one member of the family to another. But in reality, there's possible that this Edward Gibbs was related to Mary Gibbs, who was Joseph Parmenter's wife back in the second deed we were talking about over there. And also, Gardner Hunt got some land from Luther Goodnow, who could easily have been a descendant of the original John Goodnow. Susan and Gardner Hunt's children were James, Susan, Mary, and Ella Smith. In the census of 1865, it verifies that all these people were living in our house. Gardner Hunt Smith's daughter, Mary, was 4 years younger than the dashing Frank Goodnow, a shrewd businessman in insurance, and they married in 1876. They lived in our house together, but Mary died shortly afterwards after they had had a daughter named Florence Marion. At that point, Gardner Hunt Smith deeded the house over to Frank Goodnow, and later Gardner Hunt Smith died in 1896. Frank, being the worker that he was, married Hattie Louisa Smith, who lived right across the street and was Mary's first cousin, 8 years his junior. Frank and Hattie had 2 children, Frank Sidney and John Farwell, born in 1902. John graduated from Bryant Stratton Business School and never married. He was an independent and eccentric sort. I'd like to turn on the slide projector now. This is a photograph, or an etching of South Sudbury Center in about 1855. You can see there really were quite a few people here, but very much clustered around the mill. That's the mill pond where Abel Richardson had his mill. And this is a view of Boston Post Road. I think it's about 1866. Oh, there's a car. Probably later than that. And this is Sudbury Center. This is a picture of Green Hill Farm as it is today. We own a little bit further back, but basically it's only about 1 acre that we have. Right as you can see the barn across the street, that's where Farwell Smith lived, and it was Gardner Hunt Smith's brother. At the time that the Goodnows were in the house, there was a greenhouse off this side of the house, which comes towards Singletary Lane. There was no Singletary Lane there at that time. And this is the house as it is today. And this is a picture of the greenhouse with our house in the background. There's a story that Frank Goodnow enjoyed having male visitors over, and they would like to sip on a little beer, and Hattie disapproved. So she told them they could go out to the greenhouse and do it out there. So Frank spent a lot of time studying the plants. This is a picture of Farwell Smith, who was Gardner Hunt Smith's brother and lived across the street from us. And his wife was Pamelia Stone Smith. And they had 3 children, Edward, Hattie, and Carrie. Now, Hattie is the one that married Frank Goodnow. Edward married Hattie Russell Smith from the Russell Farm in Wayland. And they had a son named Shirley Farwell Smith in 1889, who was Thelma Ernst's dad. When his mother died at age 3, he went to live with his grandparents, Farwell and Pamelia Smith, across the street. This is a picture of their farm way back. When Farwell died in 1894 of pneumonia, grandmother Pamelia and little Shirley moved across the street to our house to live with Shirley's Aunt Hattie and Frank Goodnow. Another picture of Farwell's house.
Question, was that the post road in those days?
I do think that the post road went right down King Philip Road originally, but at this time when the Farwell house was there, I think that it had already bypassed this area. This is a more recent picture of Farwell's Farwell's farm, and this is Carrie Smith from the left, Pamelia Farwell's wife sitting, Hattie Smith, Edward Smith under the tree, and Farwell with the horse. Once Farwell had died, Hattie and Frank Goodnow sold Farwell Smith's house to John Hall at the time. It's Marion Hall's deceased husband. The house that John loved unfortunately burned in 1927 when he was out for a walk on New Year's Day. He was the treasurer for the town and had brought all the town's financial records home to work on over the weekend. And when he came back from the walk, he was pretty horrified to see the house up in flames. But luckily, his desk was right inside the front window, and he reached inside the window and got all the financial records out so they didn't burn. This is Hattie Smith in her younger years, Hattie Goodnow Smith. Shirley lived with Hattie and Frank until Pamelia died. But when eventually his father Edward remarried Ida Bailey. But since Shirley's mother was a Russell, he moved over to Russell Farm in Wayland. Now Hattie's sister was Carrie. And this is another picture of Hattie riding her bike, or not riding her bike. And this is Edward, Shirley's dad, very dashing. And this is Carrie. Carrie married John Frank Davis. Their children were George, Mary, and Mildred. Mary Davis Hayes is here tonight, as are two of Mildred Davis Foss's children, Margaret and Bill. The Foss family lived in our house from 1946 to 1950. Bill at the time was attending BU, but in between studies he would play tennis at the local tennis court owned by Ed Wynn up on Pokanoket. Through Bill, Ed met Mary Lou, who's Bill's sister, who was a waitress at Wayside Inn. And the two would play tennis together and eventually got married in 1951. In the same custom as her sisters, her sister Pamelia got married in May 47 and Margaret in May of 48. They all dressed for their wedding in our house and got married in the Martha Mary Chapel at the Wayside Inn, and the reception was in the small ballroom at the inn. However, Pamelia's wedding had the distinction of having a load of manure delivered to the front yard of King Philip Road to maintain John's gardens the day of the wedding. In order to quell the awful stench, they put a tarp over the whole pile. The Foss family moved out in 1950 due to increasing need for proper sewage and the water since John refused to be hooked up to the town's water system. They moved to Waltham in the house which Bill Foss still lives in. Okay, you can turn off the slide machine for a little bit. Thank you. There was a very exotic person living next door to our house. The property of the house next door was owned by the Goodnows at the time. There was a French woman who lived there in a little house that she was a little eccentric. When you went to visit her, she'd stand up and salute the French flag and sing the national anthem. And she had delusions that she was an extremely wealthy woman. Kurt Garfield remembers playing ball on the Goodnow pasture near the old Indian grinding stone, which is just over the hill from our house. It's still there at the junction of Singletary and Green Hill Road. The Goodnows had to sell after John died in 1952. John Hall had some trees in the neighborhood, and he was worried about the house catching on fire and the fire spreading to all his orchard too. So he thought it would be important to sell the house. And Harriet Richardson knew this woman named Connie Nealon, whose husband did a lot with real estate, and she mentioned to Connie that the house was for sale. And lo and behold, Don Nealon bought the house along with the 20 acres that extended back to Green Hill Road. And about 2 years later, he subdivided it, and that's how we got Singletary Road and much of, and all the way up on Windsor Road up to the sharp corner. Once the Nealons lived there, there was a couple named Walter and Nancy Taylor, who had a son who would ride his bike up and down the street, and then the whole neighborhood wondered if he'd ever live to be a teenager.
Or if you'd ever get out of diapers.
Yeah, if you ever get out of diapers, right. And after them, the Pettits moved in, who were connected with the South Shore Music Center. They liked very much to have theatrical parties, and they took out a wall in the middle of our living room. There used to be 2 rooms, the front room and the back room, which was the kitchen. They took out the center wall and made that into a movie theater for their friends. And they also, it's told in the neighborhood that they had a party at the house once where Jane Mansfield danced on the table on the porch. I was going to dress up as Jane Mansfield, but I decided to spare you. The Pettits also had formal gardens in the yard and a lighted fish pool in the back, and they had very exotic parties. After the Pettits were there, Jack and Edith Buchanan owned the house for 2 years. That was 1968 to 70. And after that, Linda and Cornell Gray owned the house. And Linda tells some stories about her son, who was 2 years old, climbing to the top of the barn roof. And it was so rotten that no adult was able to go up to retrieve him. And Cornell yelled up, "You're going to get a big spanking if you don't come down." And he yells down from the place of his power, saying, "No, Daddy, a little spanking." The little boys, her 2 little boys, noticed that the chickens like to eat worms. So one day they decided they'd cook up a couple of worms and serve them to the chickens. So they made a little campfire and were cooking worms in the backyard so their chickens could have a good dinner. One time the roof they were getting a new roof in the early 70s, and while they were in the process of roofing, there was just a plastic sheet on and a hurricane hit. And little Todd cried out in the night, "It's raining in my room!" When the insulation was being replaced in the attic, they found a book of farmers' essays owned by a member of the Smith family from 1826. Also, the elementary school used to come over to Linda's house. She'd dress in the colonial dress, and she'd show them the brick ovens, the beehive oven, and all the way the colonial people used to live in the house. And one little girl wrote her a thank you note saying, "I know it was an old house when I saw all those cobwebs." She also told me that an older man stopped by one day who claimed to be Frank Goodno's grandson. And that would have had to be Frank Sidney's son, Edward or Robert. And she had a long talk with him, telling him about the changes and him telling her about what he knew of the house. And he told her that Paul Revere supposedly slept in our house at one point. We don't know if that's true or not. Makes a good story. Anyway, now I'd like to have the slide machine again. This is the back hill behind our house. There's a gazebo that Frank Goodno made for Hattie because she liked to be out in the air. And these are some of the Goodno boys playing ball. This is Mary Davis Hayes, who's here with us tonight, playing ball up on the back hill. This is Frank Sidney Goodno in the front of our house. The small tyke. And, oops, I need to get my... This is Hattie, starting in the back, Hattie. That's Sidney and Shirley to the right. And the bottom, it's Frank and John. I have to get my list. This is Thanksgiving in 1910 in our house. Starting in the back, you can't see him too well, but it's Frank Goodnow, George Davis, Frank Davis, Sidney Goodnow, and then another Goodnow. On the front, it's Howard Davis, Hattie Goodnow. In the front, John Goodnow. And then there's Mildred Davis and Mary Davis in the front as a child. And then her sister, Carrie Davis. And this is the front parlor of our house. That's Frank Goodnow, John, and Hattie, later in their years. And this was a separate room at the time of that this picture was taken. And this is Hattie Goodnow in the middle on Mount Wachusett with her lady friends. On the left is Lottie Smith, and on the right is Mrs. Oviatt. This is Shirley Farwell Smith as a boy riding his horse. And this is Shirley Farwell Smith as an adult. This is John Farwell Goodnow when he graduated from the Bryden Stratton School of Business. And this is our house as it is today. This is the front vestibule. Coming in, this vestibule was falling off the front of the house when we moved in, and we had to put a foundation underneath and to prop it up. It used to have bullseye glass in the windows and the door, but we had to replace that. This is to the right as you go in the front door. This is our dining room. It used to be a parlor, which they only used during ministers' visits and Christmas, and very seldom, during the year. But my feeling is it must have been the original kitchen, because they have these ovens built into the wall. This is a beehive oven for baking bread. If you make the fire in the front and heat up all the bricks, and then once the bricks are hot, there's a little hole in the bricks in the top oven, and you'd scoot all the ashes down to the lower oven and take them out when they got cool. That's inside. A very ornate door. It's unfortunate, but we can't use this now because the flue from the furnace goes up through where this would vent. And this is the front half of our living room, which is part of the original house. The beams, I think, were put on, or just decorational. They were put on fairly recently, and so that is one of the older parts of the house. And this is the fireplace that used to be in the middle of the front parlor, and now it's just sort of at one end of the living room. And on the left used to be a closet. That door to the left used to be a closet, but now it goes straight through to the dining room and back to our kitchen. Above the fireplace is what they call the deacon's cabinet, where they used to put brandy when the deacon was coming over, so they heat it up and he'd bless them and think they're great people. This is the back half of our living room, which used to be the kitchen when the Goodnows were here. You can see the hook coming down from the ceiling where there was a lantern over the table. And where the bureau is where there used to be, I think it was an iron sink and a pump that brought water in from the well up on the hill. And Bill tells a story about one time when he was living there, a skunk died in the well. And nobody in the house was drinking the water, except for John. Didn't bother him one bit. He thought they were all crazy not to drink it. And this is the other back corner of what used to be the kitchen. About 6 feet in from the back wall, there's an opening for where the wood cook stove used to vent. And there used to be a door in the back corner that went into what's our kitchen now, and they used as a dining room, and also a window back there. And Mary tells the story about Hattie having a stray chicken or a hurt chicken that she wanted to keep alive in a basket in the back of the wood stove. She nursed it back to health, and it grew to be a healthy adult. This is my little boy in front of what used to be the closet. And Bill tells a story about one time he opened that closet door and found big, healthy rats. It was hard for John Goodenow to keep the house together after Frank and Hattie were gone. This is the back of the original fireplace, the original chimney that used to be the closet. And this is our kitchen that we just refurbished, but tried to keep it in the flavor of the times. There's a fireplace behind the baby there, which we use to cook our Thanksgiving dinner over. We use a reflector oven and put about a 20-pound turkey in there, and it takes almost the same length of time it does in a regular modern oven. It's a wonderful way to cook a turkey. And this is the other wall in the kitchen. There used to be a door going through to a bathroom behind that chest, but we took that door out, and now you go through the door that you can see, and it goes into a combination bathroom and laundry. And I've heard that this room was John Goodenow's bedroom at the end, when maybe his heart was too weak to get upstairs. And sharp, steep stairs they are. It's a hallway right at the top of the stairs that lead in to what we call the Paul Revere room, with the belly windows. And this has a fireplace in it that we don't use right now, but we would have to line in order to use it. So it's nice to have it there. And the other front room is the baby's room. Just couldn't help but get in all the pictures. And this wall is the interior wall in that front room that shows the angle of the original roof for the original part of the house. This is the hallway just outside those front two rooms. This used to be a bathroom that Frank put in the 1920s. Before that, there was a privy behind the barn, but this was the modern thing. But it separated the house into two different sections, so when the Fosses came to live here, there were like two different living areas, and the bathroom was a shared space. This is the back right room that used to be John Goodenow's room that I use as a catch-all room now. Since the closets in each of these bedrooms are very small, I have to use another room for my stuff. And this is just outside on the back side of the house, outside of my room, where the back stairs used to come up. But they took those out. It's the master bedroom. All very small with the slanting walls, slanting roof. This is the bathroom we redid a few years ago with a skylight to give it a little more height. And we had to rebuild this chimney. Originally, this chimney goes down to the fireplace in the kitchen, but this originally was the wood stove flue that came up from the cook stove that was in the back of our living room. So in order to make it draw well for an open fire, we had to enlarge the flue and thus rebuild the whole chimney. And this is the underneath of the stairs going up. This gives you an idea of what the original wood looked like. And the basement was a dirt basement until about 2 years ago when we had troubles with floods. And so we made a, I'd like to adjust the focus on this. We put some drainage in the basement. And this rock used to be exposed. The original floor was that upper level you can see the paint cans on. And it was only exposed like about 8 inches. And Marge Tristan's daughter used to come over here when she was little. Marge Tristan is our next door neighbor, to play. And she saw, I'd met her about a year ago, and she said, "Oh, could I come over and see the big rock in your basement?" I said, "Oh, sure, come on over." And she looked at this 8-inch high rock, and she just couldn't believe how small it was to her now as an adult. And this is a picture of our barn at the turn of the century. And this is in the pictorial history of Sudbury. This is a picture of the barn as it is now. Sandra, could you focus this a little bit? Just that knob, the top knob, yeah. a little bit better. That's good. Thank you. And we still try to keep a little bit in the tradition, our lifestyle, in the tradition of the house, even though we are suburbanites. So my husband goes to a place where they raise birds to be shot, and he shot these just at Thanksgiving time and hung them in the barn. And we ate them at Thanksgiving. Our barn, for livestock, we only have one rabbit and one dog. But as I said, Linda Haas had chickens in that room right there when she lived there. And we also keep a lot of ski equipment in there. And this is a picture of our house as it is. And this is the site of Farwell Smith's house that's no longer there, and this is the space that Marion Hall lets us use as a garden. And thank you very much for coming.